connection, obviously you won't be able to holler at me, but if the screen goes blank or something, let me know. So I appreciate that introduction. I am a research forester with the US Forest Service, and I'm based out of Knoxville, Tennessee. Currently teleworking from Blount County in Rockford. My husband, Jay Clark, is a professor, adjunct professor there at Maryville College. So some of you guys may have heard of him. He teaches in the biology department there. So I just kind of want to get started giving you guys a little bit of background on what the Forest Service is. There's a lot of confusion out there, it seems like, and the most common misconceptions I get is people call it the Forestry Service. It is not the Forestry Service, it is the Forest Service. It is also not the Park Service. So the Park Service is actually in the Department of Interior, and the Forest Service is in the Department of Agriculture. Both are federal agencies, but we operate entirely differently, and we're in totally different departments. And that's a common misconception. And actually, a lot of times, the park boundaries and the Forest Service boundaries will run together, and that is the case here with the Great Smoky Mountains. They, join boundaries with the Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee and the Pisgah National Forest over in North Carolina. So, oftentimes people are confused because, the land looks extremely similar, but they are managed very differently. The Forest Service was established in 1905, so we've been around a long time, over 100 years. The Forest Service manages 188 million acres of public land, and we also house the largest forestry research organization, and that's the part that I work for, is the research branch of the US Forest Service. And this is a picture of the first chief of the Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot. And actually, I have had the privilege of working with his great-great-granddaughter, Leela Pinchot. She's actually a graduate of University of Tennessee and actually does work now for the Forest Service. The mission of the Forest Service is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests to meet the needs of present and future generations. And our motto is caring for the land and serving people. And so we are a federal agency in the Department of Agriculture. The current secretary is Sonny Perdue, and our current chief is Vicki Christensen. She's the second female chief of the Forest Service that we've had. And there's 3 branches of the Forest Service. There's the Research and Development branch, that's who I work for. The National Forest System, which is the largest branch of the Forest Service. That's, the land management part of the Forest Service. So the Cherokee National Forest, Nantahala National Forest, et cetera. Those are probably places you've heard of. That is part of the National Forest System. And then there's state and private forestry, which is a part of the Forest Service that helps state agencies and private landowners better manage their land. So we really serve the nation's forest. As research and development, we do not just serve the national forest. We actually do research on other properties, private and state lands, as well as national forest lands. And I don't want to hit you with a graph right off the bat, but I just want to make, let's see if I can get I don't know if I can do a pointer. Let's see if I can do this. No, that doesn't make sense. Just trying to figure out how to do the pointer. Do you guys know how to do that? Annotate, is that right?
We were seeing it before and then it disappeared.
Oh, okay, mouse, maybe that's it. Okay, can you see that
there
mouse?
You go. Yes.
Okay, so what I want to point out here is in 1995, we had 16% of our budget going to wildland fire management, and the vast majority of the budget went to the National Forest System. In 2015, this is the latest numbers I was able to pull up, 52% of our budget is going to fire management, wildland fire. That's, the firefighting. And that's reduced the amount going to the National Forest System dramatically. And research has pretty much maintained, we've gone down a little bit, 8% in 95 and 6% in 2015. The point of this I want to make is that we do a lot more than just research and managing land. We're actually, heavily involved in wildland fire management, wildland firefighting, and that's something that is an ongoing issue. That's a whole nother topic for a whole nother presenter, not me. But I just want to make that point is that, we're kind of in a little bit in dire straits because of the fire issues going on out west right now. And this is a picture of what all the national forests look like in the southern region. So they're split into different regions. And the southern region is about 13 million acres of land that is managed. And we have the Cherokee National Forest, it's the only national forest in Tennessee. And then the Pisgah, Nantahala National Forests are in North Carolina. And there's, several in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. In terms of the research, we don't have a land base, so to speak, but we're kind of divided into these geographic regions. So I'm in the Southern Research Station, and there's different research stations throughout the United States. And this is what the Southern Research Station looks like. Let me get rid of that mouse. This is what the Southern Research Station looks like in where we are. So Knoxville is where I'm at. And actually there's a whole nother unit in Knoxville called Forest Inventory Analysis that I'm not part of. But they're based in Knoxville. And then I'm headquartered out of Asheville, North Carolina. That is where the Southern Research Station headquarters are, but it's also where my work unit is housed, is in Asheville. But you can see we have units spread out across the Southern United States in experimental forests as well. And in the Southern Research Station, there's 130 of us scientists and 13 work units. And I'm part of this area called Forest Ecosystem Restoration and Management. There's different areas. There's forest watershed science, threats to forest health, and forest values. And then kind of across all of that is the Inventory Analysis Unit. They call it Natural Resources Inventory and Monitoring. It's better known as Forest Inventory and Analysis, or FIA. My work unit is headquartered out of Asheville, located on the Bent Creek Experimental Forest. It's the oldest experimental forest in the eastern United States. So we're kind of proud of that fact. We're also proud of the fact that we had the first female research forester in the entire Forest Service there at Bent Creek, Margaret A. Bell. Currently, we have Tara Kaiser is my project leader and my supervisor, and she supervises 7 scientists, 5 technicians, and 1 administrative assistant. And really our goal in our work unit is to conduct long-term research to provide tools and technologies to manage upland hardwood ecosystems. So the key terms being long-term research. That's kind of what separates the Forest Service from universities. Not that universities don't do long-term research, but really the Forest Service research branch was set up specifically to conduct research that spans not just years, but decades. And we really serve, as I said, the nation's forest. We're there to help not only national forest people, but private land managers as well, and state forest agencies. So why did I get into this Forest Service as a career? Well, I started off really kind of loving the great outdoors and getting outside and hiking and camping a lot when I was in high school. My parents didn't really do that. I kind of got into that on my own, but I really figured out that I loved being outside, and I loved science as well. That was always my favorite subject in school. And so I started off at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, directly in forestry. I was really lucky in that. I chose that major straight off the bat. I looked at all the different options available to me, and I thought that would be the best fit. And the University of Tennessee, Knoxville is our land grant institution, which is basically an act that was created in the 1890s that created a system of universities, not always public, mostly public, but some private as well, to serve agricultural needs across the nation. And we're also accredited by the Society of American Foresters, which is our professional organization. So when you get a degree from a university with that accreditation, that means, that it kind of gives you a little step up in terms of getting jobs later on. Like if you were going to be hired by the Forest Service, for example, and you had to have a degree in forestry, they're going to look for that accreditation for that school. Then I pursued a master's degree also in forestry at the University of Tennessee. And then I went to Oklahoma State University and got my PhD in plant science. It was really in forestry, but forestry department there did not have a forestry PhD degree offered. So technically it was plant science. Also a land grant institution, also accredited by the Society of American Foresters. During my undergrad days, I worked in the work study program as a student worker. And then in the summer, I also worked for the forestry department for a couple of summers. And when when I was pursuing my master's degree, I was able to get an assistantship, which paid for the vast majority of my school. And that's a very common thing when you're in these natural resources professions like forestry and wildlife, is that you will get assistantships that help pay for your school tuition and give you a small stipend. It was not a teaching assistantship, it was a research assistantship. So I did things outside of my actual master's thesis project to earn that money. And it's very little money, but it was enough to, live off of, sort of. And then I got my a fellowship to do the PhD work at Oklahoma State. And after my master's degree, I worked at UT as a research assistant and worked with the Jack Daniel's distillery and helping them establish seed orchards of white oak and sugar maple. And then after my PhD, I went back to UT as well to do a postdoc on butternut, which is a tree that's also kind of been extirpated in addition to chestnut, which I'll talk about later. Butternut's also been extirpated by an exotic or non-native pathogen. So my master's thesis title was Seedling Quality and Genetics in Nursery and Field Plantings of Northern Red Oak. These are not pictures from my master's project. Actually, I couldn't find any, it's so long ago, but this was similar work. So I was working with acorns out of a seed orchard, which is this picture here. And then, working with those acorns in a commercial state nursery, growing them by genetic family, watching them grow, taking data on their development in the nursery, planting them in the field, and following them over time. And this was really kind of a seminal project in the fact that this was the first time this orchard had really produced enough acorns to do this kind of work. So it was an interesting project to be part of. And then for my PhD, I kind of shifted gears and went to the more ecology side of things. And I looked at what we call stand dynamics, which is basically just how forests change and function over time related to different impacts from like climate and disturbance, like fire. And so I studied an old growth forest there in Oklahoma in the cross timbers, and I cored hundreds of trees and looked at their growth rings and related that to climate and disturbance histories, and also took some what we call cookies, these samples of dead and down trees, cutting them into these thin slabs and sanding them down and looking at the growth rings and looking at the fire rings there. And so got that work done out there, and came back to UT for a little bit, and then got my career started in the Forest Service about 2 years or about a year after I got my PhD. And so how do you become a scientist? Well, the first thing is you have to be able to get your hands dirty and your feet dirty. You want to have interest in the natural world. Do not be afraid to go out and be in kind of rough conditions. That's part of it. You really have to have a major in one of the natural resources fields like forestry or wildlife. Or, we don't just hire foresters, we also hire, research ecologists, research biologists, research plant physiologists. So I'm saying ology fields like ecology, biology, physiology. Usually a PhD is required, although it will not state that in the application process. Typically, you will have to have a PhD to be a scientist. And I encourage you, I can't emphasize this enough. When you find an advisor, a master's or PhD advisor, a professor that's going to help you, you really need to find a mentor. And that is hard to do these days because unfortunately, a lot of professors kind of want to use grad students as labor instead of as, really teaching them and mentoring them about how to do research. But I encourage you to do that. It's hard to do, but just kind of you need to be interviewing your professor just like they need to be interviewing you for getting that position. And you need to find a fit that works for you. I encourage everyone to work and intern as much as they can in the field. Summer jobs, do volunteer work if you can. You really need to be self-motivated. Being a scientist, you have to you're not going to have people telling you what to do. You're not going to have a supervisor laying out your daily schedule. You're going to be expected to perform on your own and operate really independently. We're a lot like a university professor, although our bureaucratic system is very different. But you really have to be self-motivated and also think critically, and that's a big part of being a scientist. And I tell people that, like, really, I feel like what I'm getting paid to do is actually just think a lot of times and put things together. And we of course do collect data in the field. That's a big part of what we do. It's not easy during times like now, during COVID. And then, of course, analyzing data and then putting all that together in a publication and presentations to people. And, kind of refining that process as we go. And that's really what we do in a very short and succinct manner. And the scientific method, I think it's important to mention because this is what we follow and this is what we do overall. And I think it's important for people to understand in science, you're not trying to prove that something is true. You're trying to refute that there's no evidence to support your hypothesis, and that's a very important distinction because it's a very conservative way of looking at the world. So you really want to. You're not trying to say, "Oh, this happened, so that means this is true." You're trying to say, "Well, I have a hypothesis about why this is happening, so let's do tests to show that my hypothesis is wrong." Right? I mean, that's really what you're trying to do. Your hypothesis is, I think this is happening, but you're really testing that there is no evidence for that happening. That's really what science is. And it's important that people understand that. And unfortunately, today, people really don't understand that. So the two problems I work on predominantly are divided into these two very general categories. So oak and American chestnut. So oak is a Quercus is the genus for oak. It encompasses, multiple species. I work predominantly with upland oaks, predominantly northern red oak, Quercus ruba, or white oak, Quercus alba. Oaks as a genus are extremely common throughout the United States. The problem is they're not regenerating. And what I mean by that is that regeneration is a process that sustains their population. So an oak may be in the overstory and it's producing acorns that then fall to the ground and germinate and produce little seedlings, but then those little seedlings are not replacing the older trees as those older trees die. That is the problem that we're facing. With the American chestnut research, the research I'm working on there is quite different. The chestnut was a keystone species, and that's basically a tree or a species that has this strong influence on the ecosystem in which it resides. And without that tree, the ecosystem would be vastly different. And the American chestnut was a keystone species, but it has been decimated by a non-native pathogen. And so those are the two main research problems I work on. So I just want to delve a little bit into each of those and talk about them. So why is there an oak regeneration problem? And I'm sorry if you hear my dogs barking. Somebody's pulling up in my driveway, I think. So why do we have this oak regeneration problem? Well, in a nutshell, it's because the disturbance regime is completely out of whack. And so what do I mean by disturbance? Well, there's natural disturbances. And these are kind of background noise disturbances, if you will. So there's climate and there's weather events, which are in fact changing. But that's been around, forever, right? We've always had climate, we've always had weather. And then there's these biotic disturbances that are natural, like gap phase dynamics, which means like basically, a tree gets old and it dies and it creates a small gap in the forest. That's natural disturbance. There's also wildlife out there that eat acorns and graze and, eat or make little disturbances in the soil. And there's also pests and pathogens, like, southern pine beetle, for example, is a native pest. So those are kind of background noises, but then the real disturbances are human-caused disturbances, and they have been around for millennia. People do not understand that humans are part of our natural disturbance regime, and they have been forever. The problem is, as humans, have evolved over time, we have changed our disturbance regime. And so historically, from about 3,500 years ago to the 16th century, Native Americans were here using fire. They were clearing the land. They were doing some agriculture. They were tending the forests for a long time. And then the Europeans came in and spread disease throughout the Native American populations and forced them out and had war with the Native Americans. And that did affect the forest. And we call this the period of regrowth. The forest kind of regrew because the Native American population was pretty much decimated. And then the late 18th to early 19th century was an early European settlement period. They came in and they did some, fuel wood cutting, subsistence farming, high grading, which basically means they took whatever trees they wanted out of the forest with no regard for what was coming after. They high graded the forest. They also used fire like the Native Americans did. And then the massive disturbance events in the mid 19th to early 20th centuries came in. And this was the big disturbance event that created the forest we see today. This disturbance event where we had the Industrial Revolution, we had indiscriminate logging, uncontrolled fire, loss of the chestnut, loss of bison, loss of the passenger pigeon, conversion to large-scale agriculture, and tons of domesticated animals. That is what's created the forest you see today. Okay, that occurred about 180 to 100 years, 120 years ago. And now we're in this period of regrowth, lack of disturbances, really. We've removed fire from the disturbance regime. And we have non-native pests. So this is the massive disturbance pictures of that I want to show you. So you can see the massive logging that went on. And this is why we have the Forest Service. This is why the Forest Service was created, is because this was not sustainable, clearly. And we needed to have a true forest management regime, not just, loggers coming in and taking everything out. But this is what the forest looked like, 180 years ago. And just to prove my point a little more, this is a graph showing the age structure of the forest in Alabama and Tennessee. And you can see the majority of forests between 60 to 80 years old or 80 to 100 years old. And that is, when people say, how old do you think these forests are? I'm going to say 80 years old, because I don't even have to look at it. I just know, like, that is the age structure of our forest we have today. And the problem with oak is, if you don't disturb those stands, those 80 to 100-year-old stands, if you just leave them be, they succeed to maple or other shade tolerant. So shade tolerant means trees that can tolerate shade. They're going to succeed to those species over time, and you're going to lose your oak. And the rule of oak regeneration, or the rule of oak silviculture, is that oaks have to be present in the understory prior to any disturbance event in order to be part of the next stand. So if you just leave them be, they succeed to maple, okay? But if you disturb them, then they succeed to poplar, which is nothing wrong with poplar. Poplar's our state tree. It's a great tree. But we're losing our oak. So if you don't disturb them, you get maple. If you do disturb them, you generally get poplar. And that is the problem that my work unit works on a lot. And so our hypotheses are that you can regenerate oak with a series of disturbance events. Not just one disturbance event, but a series of disturbance events. And the trick is trying to figure out what that series looks like and the timing, and to make it practical. And so we've done things like even age regeneration, or better known as clear cutting or shelter wood harvesting. We've done a lot of work on that. We've used prescribed fire in conjunction with harvesting. We've used uneven age silviculture, or gap or group selection harvest. So these are like smaller type little openings that you create in the woods. We've used herbicide to release our oak seedlings in the woods. We've done a lot of work looking at these different disturbances to see how we can get oaks to stay in the system. And also I really concentrate on planting oak and looking at how oaks do through planting. And so with oak, I'm really summarizing our research in one slide, which is hard to do, but basically we had these hypotheses that intermediate to intense disturbances will not benefit oak. That's our null hypothesis. That's rejected. Okay, we know that we've proven or tried to show that null hypothesis is false. Treatments that have intermediate sunlight conditions were better than treatments that didn't open up the canopy. So if you go in and you disturb a stand through harvesting or fire and herbicide, you will benefit the oaks that are present. Site conditions will not affect oak. That hypothesis is also rejected. We know that drier sites generally have better oak regeneration than more mesic sites. The size of oak regeneration prior to harvesting will not affect their recruitment or regeneration. We know that that is also false. So the larger the seedlings are prior to the disturbance, the more likely they will be to be part of the next stand. So just briefly, I'll mention chestnut work, and chestnut was a keystone species. It constituted 25% of the timber volume in the southern Appalachian Mountain region around 1900. So it was hugely, it was widespread, but it was a huge part of the ecosystem here. The nuts were extremely valuable for humans, but also for wildlife. It created its own currency. People would take chestnuts into general stores and trade it for flour and bread, or flour and coffee and salt. And also the tannin was from the bark was used to make leather. And the chestnut has a host of non-native pathogens and pests that impact it, predominantly root rot, which is Phytophthora cinnamomi, and the big one is chestnut blight, Cryphonectria parasitica. And that came in around the 1890s. It was first discovered in 1904 in New York, and it's a fungus. And the native North American chestnut species, Castanea dentata, but also the chinkapin species, do not have very much resistance to this pathogen because they did not evolve with it. But there is now there's been for a number of years now a program in place to produce hybrid chestnut seedlings that will have some resistance to blight using genes from Asian species like Chinese chestnut. And the B3F3 here, this is the final hybrid that is supposed to have high levels of resistance. And that's the trees I'm working with, or the B3, or the backcross third generation trees. And I was just going to show a real quick video of our work and how it has evolved. So this is our seedlings of chestnuts being grown in the nursery, and we grow them by genetic family, so we can keep track of that throughout all the studies. And then we lift them from the nursery and we put them in these bags here. And then we take those seedlings from the nursery and we put them in our lab, and we measure everything that we can, including height, root collar diameter. We count the number of roots. We tag every single tree so we know we can follow that tree through the life of the planting. We take that tree, we plant it out in the woods using experimental design. This is a site up in Virginia where it's been harvested to open up the canopy to have sunlight hitting the forest floor. We also planted some in pretty closed canopy conditions like this site here, just to see how they would do in that different conditions. And this is just showing you the size of the seedlings again that we're planting. And that's something we think is important to overall development. This is at the time of planting, these trees are 1 year old. And then this is 1 year after planting. You can see the green up here after the harvest of the all the seedlings that come in naturally to these sites. And then this is 12 years later. And this is this chestnut seedling that we planted 12 years ago. So you can see these forests quickly adapt to disturbance and change and quickly regrow over time. And so our hypothesis that we were testing really is that the chestnuts, the hybrid chestnuts, the bred for resistance, would be competitive and have high levels of resistance. And so our null hypothesis was that hybrid seedlings would not differ from the American or Chinese chestnut, and that was rejected. So the hybrid seedlings grew slower than the American chestnuts, but they grew faster than the Chinese chestnuts. And the hybrid chestnuts also had blight resistance similar to the Chinese chestnut, more similar to the Chinese than the Americans, but not as good as the Chinese. So in other words, B3F3s are doing pretty good out there, but they're not as resistant as the Chinese chestnuts. And that is something that needs to be worked on further by the breeding program. And we looked at seedling size, and that definitely made a difference. I mean, if you plant larger seedlings, they're going to do better overall over time. And that is just as important as understanding blight resistance, because if you can't get these trees to grow and to get above deer browse line and all of that, then you're in trouble. So forestry science is not going to be ever completely understood because it's just so dynamic. I mean, what I gave you today is just a snippet of our research. And I hope I was able to explain it simply enough for you to understand some of it. As Albert Einstein says, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. But I want to leave you, with these couple of thoughts. Forests are dynamic and they're always changing. They are not static ecosystems. And the most of the species out there are adapted to change in our eastern hardwood forest. And you have to consider always human dimensions and resource limitations to be part of science. You can't, like, I could regenerate oak tomorrow if you gave me $1 million. I could tell you how to do it, right? I could grow bananas in Antarctica for that matter, but that's not practical. So you have to always consider your resource limitations as part of your science. And finally, do what you love and love what you do. This is a picture of me coring a tree, northern red oak in University of South Domain in Swanee. And I have a whole bunch of people to thank. There's a ton of people involved with these projects, from state agencies to the National Forest System, to the American Chestnut Foundation. So I want to acknowledge them. And if you guys have any questions, I will attempt to answer them.
Yeah, so if any of you have questions, you can either speak up or you can put them in the chat.
Okay, so I have a question.
Okay.
I was going to ask a question about acorn crops, but then you said the thing about bananas in Antarctica. So if you had $1 million, how would you grow bananas in Antarctica?
Oh, you would just build greenhouses and heat them, right? So you could do it.
Yeah, and I guess back to the acorn crop question. Notice like every couple of years there's like a dip in the acorn crop and like there's not as much. And I was wondering if that was like more environmental or it's just like a cycle that the trees have.
Yeah, that is a great question. And the answer is we honestly do not understand that. There's been quite a bit of work trying to understand that, why the acorn. So what he's saying is the acorn crops of red oaks, those are the two big groups, red oaks and white oaks, okay? They're divided into two groups. They generally kind of ebb and flow. So like 1 year will have what you call a bumper crop year. And right now, this year kind of seems sort of to be a little bit of a bumper crop for some white oak. And then like next year it'll be nothing. And then the year after it may be okay. And then the next year will be a bumper crop again. So it just kind of ebbs and flows. We honestly don't understand it. I mean, because it's a regional thing, you want to automatically think, oh, that's climate related. Because what else affects trees regionally except the climate? But there's been a lot of work done on that, and there's never been any kind of definitive answer. And so there may be something to do with how trees communicate with each other and their phenolics and their kind of like quote unquote hormones, so to speak, that they are producing. If they're somehow communicating with each other, I don't know. There's just a lot that we don't understand about acorn crops. And I know one of the sometimes failures are related to late season frosts. So if you have a frost in May, that will kill your oak flowers and then you won't have a crop. And that varies for white oak and red oak. Red oaks have, it takes 2 years to produce an acorn. White oaks, it takes 1 year to produce an acorn. So if you kill a flower on a red oak, you're affecting the crop the next year. If you kill a flower on a white oak, it's going to affect that immediate fall coming up. So that's a great question. I wish I could tell you more, but we don't really understand that.
Thank you.
We have a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
How has your work and research been affected by COVID is the first one.
Yeah, it's been affected because doing field work is really difficult. We have a lot of our sites are very remote and we have to have 4-wheel drive, and I have a Forest Service vehicle assigned to me, a truck, 4-wheel drive truck. I'm not willing to put 2 people inside of that vehicle. And so that really limits how we can get out in the woods. And so we've been able to get some work done by paying people mileage to drive their own vehicle. But that is kind of limited to if they have 4-wheel drive or not. And some sites, I'm just not willing to have them drive their own vehicle, quite honestly. So there's that whole issue. Overnight travel is restricted. That affects us because a lot of my sites you can't get to unless you spend the night somewhere. Meetings are canceled, so we cannot attend conferences as easily. Although some of that has been turned virtual, which has actually been beneficial because then I can attend meetings that maybe normally I wouldn't have attended because it's virtual, and now I can go because it's not costing the government anything. So it's really affected us. I mean, puts a it puts a kind of a roadblock in front of you to get the work done that you really kind of need to get done.
And someone here Monica is asking about hemlocks. She said you didn't mention them, but can you tell us if the woolly adelgid is still a major problem?
Yeah, there's a whole other unit in the Forest Service that works on hemlock woolly adelgid as part of their purview. And the scientist there is named Bud Mayfield, and that's all he does is work on hemlock. Well, he does actually do other work too, but that's his primary topic. And yes, it is a major issue. The hemlock is being devastated by a non-native insect, the hemlock woolly adelgid. There is very little natural resistance to that, because I hope you're catching this theme of when non-native species come and affect our forests, there's no genes for resistance because the species did not evolve with those particular pests and pathogens present here. And so when they come in, there's no natural defense mechanisms. So hemlock is another one that's been hit by a non-native pest. And so, yeah, it's a major issue. They have developed some insecticides that do seem to be effective. And they have these beetles that they're releasing that do seem to work in conjunction with the insecticides, but that is limited to where you can get them into the forest. So you can't just like drop them from a helicopter, or a plane. I mean, you have to hike them in. And so it's difficult at a landscape level to protect all the trees.
Sorry, I muted myself there for a second. Someone's asking, could I grow acorns in Antarctica? But then they're also following up with, do you do any work with wildlife biologists? You mentioned exotic pathogens, but how are invasive animal species harming our trees if they are?
We don't, have a major issue with introduced wildlife species impacting upland hardwood oak ecosystems. That is not something we ever really consider as an issue, as a major threat. Now there may be other forest ecosystems, like I'm trying to think of a good example of an exotic, like the boa constrictor in Florida. That would be an example of a problem in that ecosystem that is really kind of changing the dynamics of those ecosystems. But in these systems that I work, upland hardwood systems, we don't have wildlife, like non-native wildlife, as an issue. Now we do work with native wildlife species, and we have partners that come onto our studies and monitor birds and monitor salamanders and monitor reptiles, and all of the research that we've done with those partners kind of shown that the intermediate disturbance hypothesis keeps being reproven. So in other words, like these intermediate disturbances, so not clear cutting, which is a pretty intense disturbance, and not doing nothing, those two things don't benefit the most numbers of wildlife. It's the intermediate disturbances, the gap phase or group selections, the shelterwood harvesting, the introducing fire. Those are the ones that tend to increase the diversity of the wildlife species that we see. Now, certain species of wildlife only like, the closed canopy forest, or only like the open canopy forest. But in terms of diversity, what we find over and over is that they like these intermediate disturbances.
I'm going to see if anyone else has a question, and then I have a question. Actually, I have lots of questions, but I'm going to ask one. Are you and depending on this answer, I may ask another one. Are you involved, or do you know anything about the Maryville College chestnut project?
I talked to a student a couple of years ago about that, and it seemed to be a project that was basically with the American Chestnut Foundation planting their material in, it would not be what I would call a forestry type environment. It was more of a like a field type plant, like an old field type planting to kind of test their material for blight resistance. Or maybe, I think it was mainly blight resistance is what they were looking at. So I don't know a whole lot about that.
I didn't know if you were involved. I was just curious if you were involved in that.
I did meet with a student and discuss. I can't remember their name now. I'm totally blanking, but they told me, you know, what they were planning on doing, and I gave them some input on what I thought, things I needed to kind of pay attention to.
So I have a kind of off the beaten path question, which you can just say you don't want to answer. You can answer if you like. There's been a lot being said because of the wildfires. You mentioned fire as part of an important part of the ecosystem, right? So there's a lot being said about the West Coast wildfires, and I'm wondering, from your perspective as a forester and part of the Forest Service, what's your perspective on what's going on out there, and what do you think might be done to alleviate that?
Well,
or should it be alleviated? I mean,
I'll give you a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in wildfire.
Your mic, for some reason, your mic is cutting out.
You hear me?
That's better.
Okay. Let me know if it cuts out. I'm not an expert in Western wildfire management, but I will just kind of go back to my earlier slide in that our disturbance regime is just out of whack. So, and it's the same out west. So for millennia, you had Native Americans burning low intensity fires at intermediate scales. I mean, they were burning for a number of reasons: to get rid of pests, to find food better, to produce certain plants that they wanted, to clear for whatever. I mean, they were using fire as a major tool for millennia. And then they were removed, forest removed, or died from disease. And then the forest regrew into thick stands that is not really quote unquote natural, right? And that created a fire hazard. And then you had indiscriminate logging coming in, like I mentioned, out there, of course, later out there than here, but that cleared vast areas of land. And then they suppressed fire, and those forests regrew thick. And so if you look at pictures of what the forest looked like, you know, in 1850 versus today, it's a completely different. I mean, it was more open, it was more range-like, it was, you know, more grasses and those kind of things. And now it's like these thick, homogeneous forests. It's kind of the same here too, but we don't have the fire risk like they do here because we have rain and, you know, humidity. And we don't have the fuel loads that they have. So that is, in a nutshell, the main reason I think we're seeing this massive, you know, and the climate change is a massive issue, because the climate change is basically increasing temperature and changing the moisture regime, so that the fire seasons out there are now earlier than they ever were, and the fires are more intense, and so it's exacerbating the problem. But I don't think climate change is the sole problem. It's definitely not the sole. It's really a combination of the disturbance regime being changed over years, decades, to these kind of closed canopy stands that, you know, are not really, when you take the human population, Native American influence into it, it's just not natural.
Cool. Thanks so much for that answer. That was really neat to be able to hear from an expert about that directly. Anyone else have any questions before we thank Dr. Clark? All right. Well, there are ways to thank, either verbally or you can use your little reaction button and give her a round of applause, as I am doing now. And we thank you so much, Dr. Clark, for being here. And I can't remember when our next S-Cubed event is, but there is one more this semester, so be looking for that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm just right here. If anybody has any questions, just give me an email, shoot me an email, or call me.
Thanks again.
All right, thank you.
And thanks everybody for being here. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.